It is. That's very hot in the summer and cold in the winter. But there's no vents up there from an old building, and it's really hard to put them in because of the way they made it. Okay, we're turning to Ecclesiastes chapter 5. We noticed in the verses 1 through 7, there was a big change in the way that Solomon now is approaching his instruction to us. In the first 4 chapters, we see that he was really morbid. Nothing new under the sun, vanity of vanities. It's not worth living, on and on. But now in chapter 5, in verses 1 through 7, we saw the idea of true worship. And that is, of course, live prudently, or to prepare to worship the Lord. Watch your mouth. Keep your promises. And also, hold God in awe. And so we must do that in worship of the Lord. But now in verses 8 through the rest of chapter 5 and all of chapter 6, we see that he's really getting into kind of the man on the street, or the earthy things I have learned type of thing. Well, I like talking to man, and sometimes you get pretty brutal, and just say it the way it is. With ladies, you have to be careful, and of course women can get together and talk more brutally to one another, or whatever, realistically to one another. But overall, we see that he is talking just laying it out the way it is, as an old man now looking back on life, talking to younger people. He's not really saying, do as I tell you and not as I did, but he's just saying, these are the things I've learned, guys, and take it or leave it. And so, but he says, if you leave it, then I can tell you by experience that life's pretty empty. Life without God is empty. And so we see that he's very realistic in his approach in these 2 chapters now. And when he talks about things, it's common sense. Did you see this past week, or did you hear this past week? I didn't see the whole article. I just kind of, in passing, heard about some influencers, a bunch of young girls now that are making a whole bunch of money. They're pretty, and they're on the internet and all that. But they got them together someplace, I can't even remember where. But they all got on a boat. And since they were all on the boat together, I think there are 8 or 9 of them, the boat started sinking. So it doesn't matter how wealthy you are, it doesn't matter how famous you are or intelligent you are, there's just certain laws of nature, laws of science, that it doesn't matter how popular you are, if you get on a boat and you overload it, it's going to sink. And so it is in life. Simply because you're rich and famous doesn't bend the rules. There's just something about life that's like that. And that's what Solomon is saying. Now, he doesn't say, he's going to give you a lot of examples. He's not saying everybody's like this. He's not saying if you're wealthy, that means you're unhappy. But he says, I have seen that those who pursue wealth without God are pretty empty. And so we're talking about wealth and reality, or riches and reality, as I've called this section. And he says that he found all the pursuits that he had been looking at. He explored nature, remember that, and the cycles of life and the cycles of the universe. Philosophy, we looked at different things like existentialism and hedonism and fatalism and all the rest that he got into. And then he wanted to prove by experience that pleasure couldn't bring happiness. And of course, he really wrecked his life by doing so. And materialism, and then we looked at last week, religion without God, or religion as a ritual, leaves you empty. And so now he begins with money and morality in verses, the rest of the chapter of chapter 5. And we're going to see in chapter 7, he's going to go into the idea of simply because you're intelligent and your mental faculties don't guarantee a moral turpitude. In other words, you can be very brilliant and yet be morally corrupt. And so we see the dichotomy that he keeps showing back and forth. And so in chapter 5 now, we see that he talks about money and morality. And so I'm just going to, instead of reading the whole chapter, we're going to kind of take it by sections. So in verses 8, he says, if you see oppression of the poor and violent perversion of justice and righteousness in a province, do not marvel at the matter, for high official watches over high official, and higher officials over them. Moreover, the profit of the land is for all. Even the king is served from the field. Now, first of all, then he is saying that you can't get over the fact that there's oppression in society. And one of the things that the wealthy do, and we've noticed that we call them the elite or whatever today, the wealthier kids or the wealthier people that have gone to school, all of a sudden they've got all this brilliance, and now they want to solve the world's problems, but without God. And all of a sudden they become the activists. They have a hunger, they have something inside that they want to do something, but they have rejected God. And so as a result, we see them getting angrier and angrier. In fact, let me just turn with you over to Hosea. And Hosea talks about how that the children of Israel, once they rejected God, in chapter 4, verse 1, he says, hear the word of the Lord, you children of Israel, for the Lord brings a charge against the inhabitants of the land. There is no truth or mercy or knowledge of God in the land. Notice they had rejected truth. So as a result, they rejected loyal love or mercy, and there's no knowledge. So the priests weren't teaching. In fact, later on he says, like priests, like people, and he condemned the priests for not teaching. And so he says, there's no truth and knowledge of God in the land. Therefore, notice what he says in verse 2 of Hosea chapter 4. By swearing and lying. Do we not have a lot of swearing and lying today? In fact, the better the liar, the more intelligent people think that he is or she is. There's swearing and lying and talking about foul mouths, both men and women. It just is so sickening to see some pretty news anchor up there using some of the vilest language. It just turns her ugly over. And of course, guys, it's bad, but as a guy, you think girls, you want to call them ladies. And it's hard to call them ladies when they're doing that kind of stuff. But he says, by swearing and lying, killing and stealing, committing adultery, with bloodshed upon bloodshed. In other words, people are killing each other and it's not really hitting the news. Isn't that what our society is like today? Now, I'm not saying that we don't ever read the United States into Israel's history. All I'm saying is this is the principle. Once you know God and you reject him, these are the things that come along. So these people knew God, and now the very things that they did back 3,000 years ago, we're having problems with today because the principles never change. And the country may change, and we are not Israel, and we don't have priests and so forth, but the principle of man, or principle of people, is there. And when you reject God, these are the problems you get into. Therefore the land will mourn, and everyone who dwells there will waste away with the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, even the fish of the sea. Let no man contend or rebuke another. So he goes on. So men are wishy-washy. Don't tell someone that they're wrong. And so you can go down the list there. I mean, don't judge me. Well, we won't judge anybody. So we'll let all the foreign religions come in, and some of them have been around for 2 millennia, and their whole idea is to destroy Western civilization. But let's don't offend them. And we have all these philosophies and all these things that are just invading us because we don't want to offend anyone. We want to love everyone. Well, as we say, love and truth go together. And so we see that love has to rebuke and love has to stand on certain things, and there are hills to die on. And so he says this. And so as we go back to chapter 5 of of Ecclesiastes, we see that there is oppression. I mean, and as a Christian, we have to watch out that we're not the oppressors. You get a little bit of wealth, you get a little bit of things going on. You want to be careful with what God gives you. And the last thing you want is greed. But it's one thing to compete in business. It's another thing to destroy someone's life with business. And so he says we can be oppressors, and we can forget to be kind to people. And once we get a little uppity, we think that if everybody just did what we did, and God would bless them like you did us. I've got a son that has gone to a church. He moved town, and he said, "Dad, the church is really good, but the people live like because there's an upper class church." And he says, "They all think that if you don't have what they have, then you're not spiritual." And isn't that true in a lot of churches? That's the last thing we want to be here. But that's true. And he says, as a result of that, actually you are oppressing people because they will never have what you have. And they'll walk away saying, God's not good to me like he is to them. And then you got the health and wealth crowd, you just have faith in God and he'll bless you. And of course, if you don't have a Cadillac like I do, or a BMW or whatever, then you're not spiritual like I am. So even in our spirituality, we can be oppressors. And so, of course, then the poor you always have with you. What do you do with them? And so with wealth comes, with the prosperity comes sometimes unintentional consequences is oppression of others. So we want to be careful that we shall give, and that shall be given unto us. But the oppressed are victims of the successful to perverse, and those are the greedy ones. Use the law to their advantage. So once you get a little bit of power, then all of a sudden you have connections in high places, and now all of a sudden you can really pull strings. And the perverse, as he uses this word twice here, perversion, that's the person who's gone that route. Might makes right. And I have seen Christians get to that point where they don't mind running over other people. All because, of course, God's blessed them. And so we have to be careful that we still have compassion one for another. And simply because God has blessed you doesn't mean that that person's going through the trials that they're going through, that he has blessed you any more than he's blessed them. Because you're going to go through those trials one of those days. And that's why we exhort one another, and so much the more as we see that day approaching. Because we know that except by the grace of God, there I am. And so we have to be careful with our attitudes toward the things of God and what God has given us. Then we get into those who love money. And of course, it's not money that is the root of all evils. It is the love of money, or the craving for money and living for money, that is the root of all evils. Verse 10, he says, "He who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, nor he who loves abundance with increase. This is also emptiness," or vanity. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. So what profit have the owners except to see them with their own eyes? And now, so we see in this passage, in verses 10 through 12, he is saying, the one thing about people with money is they're never happy with just what they have. Why is it that the people strive for money and they make their $1 million, $1 billion, whatever? They always want more. Elon Musk wants more. Look at people with millions and millions. They want more. The people down that have won, they've gone down to Hard Rock down here. And I don't know anything about it, but I've heard that you walk in there and you got the people, and they'll spend all day. And if they win the jackpot, guess what? They're still there till they lose it all, because they're going to win more. There's just something about silver, something about money, the craving of money, that no matter what you have. And of course, those who crave money, if they blow it, then guess what? They want more, more, and more. So it depends on how you can use it. But he says, nor is there he who loves abundance. He still increase. One of the things, and I'm a rich person, when I say that, God has blessed me mightily. I'm an American. I've got 2 cars in the garage. I've got all the food I want. I paid off my car this past week. All my bills are caught up. I mean, I'm a pretty wealthy person. But there's the guy next down the street from me. He makes a little bit more money than I do, and if I had the car he had, see, there's always that. I don't have enough. I don't have enough. Or now my wife and I were trying to make plans to go see some of our kids. We got a grandchild. Our oldest grandchild is graduating from high school. And then we got another relative that's 1,400 miles away that's going to get married. I can't go to all those things, I don't have the money, for one thing. If I was a little richer, isn't it always, whatever you have, there's always more. And then, of course, you have a little doctor bill and it just wipes out everything. And so you have that problem. No matter what you have, it's never enough, especially those who are concentrating and making money their God. We all have friends like that, or people, or acquaintances anyway. Everything is cutthroat. They're going to beat somebody out. They compete. Now, again, there's nothing wrong with competing, and he's not making blanket statements to these things here. There are a lot of people that know how to compete in the marketplace, and they do quite well, and they're quite generous. In fact, I was reading about one guy. He's an older fellow now, but he had made quite a bit of money, and he is retired and quite comfortably. But he was listening to some of his friends talking about yachts and airplanes and all this stuff. And he's just sitting over there smiling, and he didn't mention anything that he had. And finally, someone said, "Well, what do you have?" And he says, "I just bought a missionary airplane in Africa, and I'm making investments for eternity." And boy, it feels good. It wasn't, just the idea of he had the money, and so he was doing, more blessed to give than to receive. Now, he didn't do it in pride. He was doing it as a result of their pride. And so, his temptation would have been, I can compete with them, and I'm just as good as they are. But he didn't think. It was a whole different value system. If God's given it to me, then I'm going to use it for his glory. I like what one man said. He said, my full-time job is to serve the Lord. My part-time job is to finance it. And so, it's the idea of, well, what do you do with your money? And so the whole attitude toward money. So he says satisfaction doesn't come from money. It's always elusive. It's always, you never can get to it. Riches do not quench the yearning of the soul, and you can't buy happiness and peace. Notice if goods increase, they increase with those who eat them. In other words, other people, guess what? If you have money, you got a lot of friends, and you got a lot of relatives, and you got all kinds of people. If you give a little bit of money to some of these organizations, it's not long before you have a stack of mail from people that want more. And so, there's people always out there, and you've always got that destitute person. Now, there again, he is not saying that you don't help the destitute, and that we don't have compassion for others. He's just saying that this is the godless, or the man who lives without God. He's not going to be happy, and the rich get richer and the poor get poorer and all this. But what is he doing as far as fulfillment in life? And it's not going to come outside of really giving your heart and life to the Lord. And so then he mentions, and he's going to do this twice. He's going to start in chapter 6 with this. But he says, there's a severe evil which I have seen under the sun. Notice this is a life of experience. This is what I've seen living outside of the will of God under the sun. S-U-N, not S-O-N. When he's under the sun, S-O-N, it's a different story. But he says, First of all, riches kept for their owner, riches kept for their owner to his hurt. In other words, greed. Riches doesn't buy happiness. And it will for a while, maybe for a couple of days. But you think about it. I just told you I had 2 cars in the garage. I'm a rich guy until those repair bills come along and insurance bills, and there's always something comes along. If I just had a little more. And so riches, a lot of times, but if that's all I'm going to live for is a car, and I know guys who live for a car. I mean, especially young people. I've known guys who they buy a car way beyond their means. They work like crazy to pay for it, and their whole glory in life is to drive through McDonald's parking lot on Friday night so everybody can look at it. You know people like that? I remember seeing it, and I used to always laugh about, you could always tell a guy in a Stingray, Corvette. The guy who owns it, but then you got the people in the passenger seat. And I always loved to see the guy in the passenger seat because he's sitting there with his arm up there and he's kind of looking like I'm a big shot. I don't know the car this guy does, but I'm a big shot. And he's going through, look at me girls, I'm here in McDonald's parking lot. Or let's go to Burger King or, or whatever. And so, and then you have a steady line of cars that drive through and just look what I've got. And they're mortgaged to the hilt, House that, or people buy houses like that, or boats, or whatever else. The good life. And yet, does it really bring happiness? He says there's a severe evil to that. He says, but riches perish through misfortune. So the worst thing that can happen to that guy driving through the parking lot is to drive out and somebody hits his car. It happens, there again, all that money, and all of a sudden now you don't have good insurance. You find out what kind of insurance you have when you need it. And so he says, when he begets a son, there's nothing in his hand. Okay, I found that true both ways. My son had nothing in his hand, and by the time I paid for him, I had nothing in my hand. But he is saying, and he who comes from his mother's womb, naked shall he return. That's the one equalizer in life, isn't it? How many of you had clothes on when you were born? The rest of your life you spent getting clothes. The receiving blanket and all those different terms that they use, for babies. Only till you die, of course they dress you up, but you're basically clothes. Who cares what you have on then? And so it's just a realm of life that what makes us so different is that what makes us so much alike is that we all think our problems are so different. But I was in a very wealthy man's house one time. In fact, he had gardeners. He had his own big motor home out to the side. In fact, I went out and talked to him. I said, it really must be nice to go on vacation. He said, I don't go on vacation. I just go whenever I want to. I'm going, oh, okay. And he had flowers, and all this. But I was cleaning his windows on the inside. And I went to his bedroom, and I was cleaning the windows and all that in there. And I looked on the side, and he had all the books. This was back several years ago when James Dobson was very popular. And he had all the books on marriage and family and everything that a poor person would have had. I'm thinking, he's got the same problems I got. It doesn't matter. He's got all this money. In fact, he's got too much time on his hands. He inherited it all. And everybody was coming. Boy, he was very popular. And boy, it was and I was just cleaning windows. I was working for another company. But those guys that worked for him really thought they were, maybe he'll give me something someday or whatever, And they treated him like a king. And it just kind of grated me. But at the same time, I don't know whether I was envious or not. But at one time I was at one window, and I noticed the window. And I was in college at the time, and it had a beautiful green curtain. Then it had all the stuff inside. I looked at that, and I said, that curtain cost more than all my possessions that I own right now, being in college and everything. I mean, everything I owned was in a 67 Ford. I mean, I could put it all in 67 Ford at the time. And I thought that was just one window. But he had the same problems I had. In fact, he probably had a few more because he was bored stiff. Yeah, it's kind of sad. I was busy. I couldn't. One problem I didn't have was boredom. I was having to live. I don't say that. I was in college in a dorm, so that means I could eat. But even with that, you're always hungry. As a young guy in his 20s. But how sad that is. But really, that guy, I think, has passed away now. Guess what happened to his clothes? Guess what happened to his mansion? Yeah. And guess what happened to all those gardeners and all the things that he had out there? I hope they're doing well. But, they're good. Naked I came into the world, and naked I return. And there's one of those terms that we use, even in today's vernacular and so forth. So we see the evils that are associated with riches is that, those who live high die hard. Really, how many people do you know that are wealthy or powerful, and they have some debilitating disease that kills them? I mean, is there a difference between him having the debilitating disease or some pauper having it? Everything gets us. And so he said, there's a lot of common denominators in life. And no matter what you have, reality's there. You put too many people in a boat and it sinks. You catch a certain disease and you're going to kill you. It's going to kill you. If you do certain things in life, there's no going back. It's going to affect everybody. And so he says that these grievous situations in her life. But notice now what he's doing is he starts blending godly wisdom in with this. And that's why sometimes it's very difficult to outline this, because he'll be talking and being very negative, and then all of a sudden he'll inject what he's learned about God in it. He says, notice in verse 18. He says, here is what I have seen. This is what I've learned. It is good and fitting for one to eat and drink and to enjoy the things of all of his labor in which he toils under the sun all the days of his life, which God gives him, for it is his heritage. As for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth and given him power to eat of it, to receive his heritage and to rejoice in his labors, this is a gift of God. For he will not dwell unduly on all the days of his life, because God keeps him busy with the joy of his heart. Notice God keeps him busy. God gives him a mission. God leads him along. No matter if he's wealthy or poor, God leads his dear children along, and he keeps them busy. And the Bible tells us that God cursed the earth for man's sake. Why? To keep us busy, to keep us working. Now, notice the attitude here, though. He says that with God, you can realize that you have a purpose. And we've talked about there's a purpose under heaven. You have a purpose for living. God has something in this great universe for you to do, and for you to be a blessing to others through him. And that's what purpose of life is all about. And so he will keep you busy in doing that. And that God will, man can really enjoy stewardship. The idea that this is what God's given me, so therefore I'm going to use it to the best of my abilities. It might be little or it might be a lot. But whatever it is, it's God's. Whether therefore I eat or drink or whatever I do, I want it to be something where it's going to be my legacy. And he'll get to that in chapter 7. But, 'tis one life, which will soon be past. Only what's done for God will last. And so I've seen, as a pastor, I grew up during the big church era, and I saw a lot of people build empires. But you go by several of those churches today, and they're empty. And some of them are bankrupt. Some of them are no more. I think of one right now just popped in my mind. I mean, it was one of the leading ones in the country, and it doesn't even exist anymore. Because after he died, everything fell apart. The Bible tells us that when we walk with God, our fruit will remain. So what will remain? In other words, what blessing? Now, the man was a good man. I'm not saying that that doesn't happen. And I know there's a lot of disciples that have been greatly influenced by their ministries. But in the end, the empire wasn't the buildings. It's what God had done in the hearts of others. So he said the one thing that you can enjoy is the stewardship of what God's given you, the blessing, the heritage of what's given you. And God has given you work as a blessing. Blessed is the man whose employment is also his hobby. Or his hobby is also his employment, job. A person who can enjoy life no matter where God has put you. And so, yes, if God blesses me with great increase, praise the Lord, I can use it. And yes, that does mean, and I know by personal experience, it's a whole lot easier to live with your bills paid than when you get knocked out by some disaster. And you don't know where the next dollar's coming from. So yeah, I know that, and we all do. And so what I've learned, and boy, God has not given me a lot of money. I'm a small church and all that. But it has been so good the last 5 or 10 years just to see somebody with a need and send them $100. I couldn't have done that for most of my marriage because we had 4 kids and all that. But it sure is fun now. Just don't have a whole lot, but if it could bless somebody else. And there was a family that he was dying from cancer, or she was dying from cancer, but they had really been a blessing to us when we were in Kansas City. And now she's dying from cancer. Oh, what a blessing it was to have a little bit of money to send knowing that they were tight. And then Timothy had just a couple that treated him and Danielle they just took him right in and became like parents to him whenever they were in college. I don't know if those kids would have enjoyed college if it hadn't been for them. But he was dying from cancer. It was so good. Without being the person that's on the receiving end. And so I want to say, Lord, if you give it to me, I want to be a blessing to others. And so that's the stewardship. And there again, I'm just saying it's more blessed to give than to receive. And so, Lord, I want to save my money. Yes, I got every retirement. And that's one thing I do fear. I don't have a lot of money for retirement. When I say fear, I am concerned about, the rest of my life and when the Lord calls my wife and I to a point where we can't work anymore. But at the same time, God will provide. Now, I'm not going to be careless with it, but at the same time, I expect God to provide. Now, again, every one of us have our different takes on that, and every one of us are a little bit different in those areas, and yet, basically, we're all the same. And so then we go to chapter 6, and here's the frustrations. He gets into them. We're going to try to cover this real fast. Life under the sun. Notice he says the frustrations of the wealthy. First of all, there's an evil. There's that evil again. There's just something bad about this, which I've seen under the sun without God. And it is common among men. So this is a common problem that people that don't know the Lord have. A man to whom God has given riches and wealth and honor, so that he lacks nothing for himself, all his desires, yet God does not give him power to eat of it, but a foreigner consumes it. Now, back in 2 Chronicles, chapter 1, verse 12, God promised Solomon, as a young man, I'm going to give you riches and honor and power. But at the end of his life, the one thing that God didn't tell him he was going to give him was the ability to enjoy it. Think about it. God can give you all that, but in the end, God is the one who gives you the ability to enjoy it. Solomon now is an old man with all the problems he's had, defying God and all the wealth that he attained. all the women he married, all these different things, life without God. And he says, I've got all this, and I don't have the ability to enjoy it. The Howard Hugheses and others that we've heard, the multimillionaires, and they die in some very strange ways. If you ever read anything about Howard Hughes, the guy was just a filthy mess at the end of his life. His fingernails grew out real long, and I won't get it. It's sickening. He lived worse than a guy on Skid Row. And how sad. At the time, one of the world's richest men, if not the richest, lived like that. But life under the sun. He had all this money, all this power, and yet he didn't have the ability to enjoy it. And he said, this is common among men. Not everybody, praise the Lord, but there are many that are like that. And then he says, others can enjoy the benefits of the wealthy more than themselves. Notice he goes on, he says here, a man to whom God has given riches and honor, he says, and yet God does not give him the power to eat of it, for it consumes it. This is vanity. He says, if a man begets he says, other people enjoy it. Okay, so he's saying, actually, other people, so I have all this stuff. And think about the museum. There's a couple of houses here that people will pay to go see the way people used to live. I get more enjoy going in to see how the Vanderbilts or some of the Bellingraths down in Alabama or the Flaglers down in around Tampa area. I mean, those people were tycoons. And I probably enjoy going to see those places, especially the historical stuff, more than they did. But by the way, I'm enjoying it more because they're dead. So isn't it interesting? A lot of times, people can enjoy your riches more than you enjoy them yourself. But then the other thing here is that wealth can be an affliction. Wealth can be a curse. That's what he's basically saying here. He says this is vanity and an evil affliction. It's really bad when it gets like that. And then verses 3 through 6, he talks about the double blessing. Boy, guess what? If I have 100 children, now he had the capacity to have 100 children, and live many years. He didn't live past 70, but let's say he doubled his life expectancy, so that the days of his years are many, but his soul is not satisfied with goodness, or indeed he has no burial. I say it is better for a stillborn child is better than not an aborted child, but a stillborn child. He said it'd be better. Remember what he said about it'd be better if I'd never lived? Now he's coming back to that. He said, basically, he's saying, I've got 100 children. And that's one thing we've mentioned before. We don't know how many, we know how many children, or we think about approximately how many children that David had at different stages of his life. They're numbered. But out of 1,000 wives, there's only one child named in the Bible. That was Solomon's. And that was a real dingbat by the name of Rehoboam. And so it's kind of interesting. None of his other children are mentioned. And so he didn't even get the legacy of having all those children and all those wives mentioned. And so we see that life's empty. It's like a stillborn. It's better that I've never even been born. Been better if whatever. And so he says, and an empty life comes with vanity. And notice he says that in verse 4. When he says, for it comes in vanity and departs in darkness. What good is your life? That's the whole idea of the pursuit of happiness, finding your purpose in life, to do it. Without it, you're empty. And if you never find it, then it's darkness. And people die in darkness. But Paul says, I came that I may turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan into God. That's all the ministry of the gospel, is to help people see the difference between darkness and light. In him was life, or in him was light, And that life was, okay, in him was life, and that life was the light of men. There we go. I'm sorry. Pastor's moment there for a second. But there again, so we see that that light and life. I have come that you may have life, and that you may have it more purposely, abundantly. But if you don't have it, then you die in darkness. You live in darkness. You die in darkness. And then increased labor. Notice he said, boy, there's people, I mean, you look at some of these workaholics. Now, I'm not into politics, but what motivates a guy like Donald Trump to work 20 hours a day? And he's a wealthy man. I'm not saying anything's wrong with that. In fact, I wish I had half his energy. Sometimes I get mad at myself because I just can't do what I'd like to do. I'm getting a little older now. I got out and worked in my yard 2 times already this week, and I'm tired today. Oh, I wish I could get out and do more. I wish I could stay up. I wish I only needed 4 hours of sleep a night. And yet, if I didn't have a purpose, all I'm going to be is bored. And so as a result of that, he says, increased labor doesn't satisfy the longings of the soul. And all labor, basically, really, you think about it, all your labor, if you don't eat. Basically, we talk about bring home the bacon. Whatever. Think about it. That's the number one thing. If you don't have food, and that's your first priority, is to eat. So really, it all boils back down. You could lose everything, but if you lose the ability to eat, you got problems. But then he says, for what more has a wise man than a fool? There again, no matter if you're a wise man or a fool, we all have the same basic needs. But then notice in verse 9 he says, but it is better is the sight of the eyes, the direction of the eyes, than a wandering desire. It's better in life, even for the person living in darkness, to have a purpose in life. A goal to run for. But the sad thing about it is the people that someone has said, I think it's Stephen Covey or whatever, who was a man that dealt with for the executives. But he used the example of executives that climbed the ladder of success only to find out that the ladder is leaning against the wrong wall. And so it is in life. So many times, boy, I got this goal, and if I get it, I'm going to be happy. And you get there and you say, is this all there is? Did I have the wrong wall? Did I have the wrong goals? And so he says, yes, but even with that, it's better to have a purpose life than to have nothing but a wanderer. So yeah, that's basic street knowledge. It's something that people should have in life. But then verse 10 through 10:11, he talks about actually 10 through 12. He really sums it up. In the end, man has no control over his destiny. We take what God gives us and purpose in our heart to use it. But in the end, as Paul says, some plant, some water, but God gives the increase. And the one thing I've always taught kids and so forth, especially basketball or whatever, you just get out and do your best and do what God calls you to do. Play honestly, realize you're representing the Lord. And if that ball's on the rim and with the buzzer's ringing, if it falls out or if it falls in, you can walk away there saying, I know this is the will of God, because I've done my very best and it was all up to God. And that's what we want, isn't it? I can't do everything, but I can do my best. And so he tells us, he says in verse 10, whatever one is, he has been named already. God's already named you. And thus, God has control even of your name. He says, for it is known that he is a man, and he cannot contend with him who is mightier than he. You don't have any control over your parents. You don't even have any control over where you were born, when you were born. And who named you? Like some people, what did your mother have against you by the name she gave you or whatever, you know? But you didn't have any control over that. You came into the life without any control. And guess what? You're going to go out of life the same way because there's a sovereign God who's mightier than you. And to fight him is foolish. He says, since there are many things that increase in vanity, how is man better? Or the idea that was reasoning and complaining. I mean, you can do all that all you want to, but in the end, all it does is lead to more frustration. Blessed is the man who does not sit in the seat of the scornful or the way of sinners or complainers. And so it's not going to get you anywhere. It just makes you more miserable. But then in verse 12, he sums it up. For who knows what is good for man in life? All the days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow. James says like a vapor. It's like nothing. Who can tell a man what will happen after he is after him under the sun? So you didn't have any choice how you came into the world. And you have no choice about what's going to happen to you in eternity. You have the choice now about where you're going to spend it. And God's given you that. But you won't control. It's not like that man I think we talked about the other day who said, someone asked him, if you got to heaven and St. Peter said, why should you come into heaven? And he said, well, because I deserve it. And I don't believe in Jesus, therefore he has no authority over me. Well, dream on. Dream on. God is sovereign. And simply because you don't believe it, and there's a whole world out there, that's one of the big problems in our country today. We got a lot of people that don't believe God's in control. But simply because you don't believe it, or because you're too intelligent, or that your university or whatever has taught you how superior you are without him, in the end, you're going to meet him. I don't believe that. One day you will. One day you will. Okay, any comments or questions about what we talked about tonight? Really kind of a pithy sayings, aren't they? I mean, just kind of an old streetwise, hey, here it is, guys, take it or leave it type of thing. Kind of brutal in a lot of ways. But it's talking turkey. Okay, am I still on or are you turning me off? You're still on. Okay, if you'll turn us off, I'd appreciate it.